When Lucia was a child, the game had no real name. It was something the older kids taught the younger ones during long afternoons when the heat pressed everything flat and the adults slept behind closed doors. Someone would say, Cierren los ojos, and everyone would obey because it felt serious, ceremonial. Knees and palms met dirt. The earth smelled alive, peppery and warm. When the count began, they crawled, not away from something, toward it. They moved carefully, feeling for ankles, for breath, for the faint disturbances that meant another body was near. When the counting stopped, they opened their eyes all at once and searched for the witch. There was always a witch. Someone hidden just well enough. Someone who knew where to pause, when to wait, when to move again. Lucia never volunteered to be it. She never had to. They always found her last. She grew up in a town that did not announce itself. A few roads stitched between fields, houses low and wide, painted colors that faded into each other under the sun, chickens crossing wherever they pleased, a river that curved like a thought someone abandoned halfway through. Her grandmother, Doña Elvira, lived with her until Lucia was 13. Elvira smelled like smoke and herbs and something metallic, like old coins. She never said magic. She said escucha, listen. Lucia learned which plants soothed skin and which made it burn, which stories could be told before bed, and which ones had to wait until morning. She learned that some dreams came from inside and some arrived already traveling. When Elvira died, the house felt quieter but not emptier. Things still moved, doors still sighed. Lucia still felt watched in a way that did not scare her. Years passed. The town stayed small. Lucia stayed. She worked mornings at the panaderia, afternoons in the fields during harvest season. At night, she walked the dirt roads barefoot, letting the ground cool her. Sometimes, without meaning to, she took one step and arrived somewhere else. At first, it happened only when she was exhausted. A blink. A shift. She would find herself standing at the edge of the river when she'd meant to stop by the fence, or in the back room of the church when she'd been headed home. The world felt thin in those moments, like cloth worn soft. She told no one. The night she learned the truth, she was sitting with her Aunt Maribel, shelling beans on the porch. The cicadas were loud enough to feel like static. Lucia mentioned casually that she'd lost time again. Maribel didn't ask questions. She just nodded, as if confirming something she'd already filed away. Your grandmother waited for you to notice, she said. You took your time. Lucia laughed. Notice what? Maribel's hands never stopped moving. You don't walk places, she said gently. You pass through them. The word bruja arrived without drama. No thunder, no wind, just a name for something that had been happening anyway. Lucia felt relief before fear, like finally knowing what language her body had been speaking. The first time she crossed farther than her town, it was by accident. She was thinking about nothing in particular, watching dust spin in a shaft of light, and then the air changed. The sky tilted. The smells rearranged themselves. She stood in a place that looked almost right. Fields again. A house again. But the colors were wrong, saturated too deeply, as if painted by someone who wanted to be believed. The wind moved differently. Time felt thick. That's where she met Mateo. He was sitting on a fence, humming to himself, eyes closed. He opened them when she stepped too loudly, and for a moment they just stared at each other, both trying to decide if the other was real. You're not from here, he said finally, smiling like he'd guessed a riddle. Neither are you, she almost replied, but didn't. Mateo lived between worlds without knowing it. His parents owned land in this version of the town, larger, more orderly. They spoke often about tradition, about keeping things clean and explainable. Matteo spoke about music, about leaving, about how sometimes he felt like he was repeating himself across days that refused to move. Lucia visited when she could. She learned the edges of that reality, how to arrive without tearing anything. She and Matteo walked together, shoulders brushing, conversations wandering. He touched her wrist once, absent-mindedly, and the contact echoed longer than it should have. When he kissed her, it was tentative, reverent, sweet in a way that made her chest ache. He didn't ask questions she couldn't answer. She didn't tell truths that might fracture him. But fractures find their own way. His parents noticed her quickly. Her accent, her silences, the way objects seemed to settle when she entered a room. They asked where she came from. They asked why she appeared and disappeared without warning. One night, Matteo asked directly, "What are you?" he said, not cruelly, just scared. Lucia told him, carefully, not as a confession, but as an offering. He listened. He held her hand. He promised nothing, and that felt like honesty. His parents found out anyway. They confronted her in the kitchen, symbols nailed above doorways, prayers sharpened into weapons. They spoke of corruption, of influence, of sickness that spreads quietly. Matteo stood there, hands clenched, eyes on the floor. "Say something," Lucia said softly. He didn't. The silence was louder than rejection. She left without tearing the world open. She returned home and folded herself into familiar dirt, familiar breath. The grief arrived slowly, respectfully, like someone knocking and waiting to be let in. Days later, someone sat beside her on the porch without asking. Isabella. They had known each other since childhood. Isabella with her steady gaze, her patience that wasn't passive but deliberate. She had always watched Lucia the way you watch water, not trying to control it, just understanding its habits. "You came back sad," Isabella said. Not a question. Lucia leaned into her shoulder before she could stop herself. Isabella stayed. That night, when Lucia dreamed they were crawling again, eyes closed, hands searching. This time, when the count ended, Lucia did not hide. She waited. After Matteo, Lucia learned that grief did not always arrive as sharpness. Sometimes it arrived as weight, the kind that did not crush but made movement deliberate. She woke earlier. She spoke less. Her body remembered a closeness that was no longer allowed to exist, and it held that memory like a pressed flower. Isabella noticed everything without announcing that she had noticed. They fell into a rhythm that felt older than intention. Mornings together in the kitchen, coffee strong and almost bitter, the radio low. Isabella chopping fruit with precise movements, Lucia leaning against the counter, watching her hands. Evenings walking the dirt roads, shoulders brushing occasionally, never by accident, but never explained. Lucia did not tell Isabella everything. She did not have to. When she disappeared for hours, sometimes days, Isabella did not ask where she had been. She asked if Lucia was tired, if she had eaten, if she needed quiet. The crossings changed after Matteo. They became less accidental, more responsive. Lucia discovered that her body answered emotion faster than thought. Longing made the world thin. Shame tore it. Love, even remembered love, softened it. She learned to arrive in places that felt unfinished. Worlds paused mid-sentence. Versions of her town where the river ran dry or flooded constantly. Fields where the crops grew too tall, too fast. Houses where families sat at tables that never cleared. Meals repeating without end. She saw echoes of herself. Some braver, some lonelier, some already broken in ways she hadn't learned yet. Each time, she came back carrying residue, smells that clung, a tension behind her eyes. Isabella would touch her shoulder, firm and grounding, and Lucia would breathe again. One night, they lay on the roof of Isabella's house, watching stars rearrange themselves slowly. You leave when you hurt, Isabella said, gaze fixed upward. Lucia smiled without humor. I come back when I can. Isabella turned her head then. Their faces were close enough that Lucia could see the tiny scar near Isabella's eyebrow, the one she'd gotten as a child falling off a bike. Lucia had cleaned the blood back then, hands shaking, heart loud. You don't have to go alone, Isabella said. The words settled between them, heavy and warm. Lucia did not answer. She reached for Isabella's hand instead, fingers threading carefully, as if asking permission with touch rather than language. Isabella squeezed once, a yes that didn't rush. The town shifted subtly after that.